Well, it's time to talk about another story, and since I now have a schedule and I'm a little bit ahead and I have been procrastinating fiercely on other projects, I actually have this set up so I might be able to stay more on a schedule and get these out on a little bit more regular of a basis. Here's hoping. So today we're going to talk about No Man Can Tame by Miranda Honfleur. Now, this story is the first book in the Dark Elves of Nightbloom series, and it is one of my favorite types of retellings, which is a Beauty and the Beast retelling. Now, don't get me wrong, I do enjoy some of the lesser known fairy tales being retold. I actually like almost all of them, seeing the different way that authors put together the pieces and surprise readers, or sometimes just give it a beautiful twist and completely meet expectations. But Beauty and the Beast is my favorite by far. And this story, even though I have read many, many Beauty and the Beast retellings over the years, and I have loved some, felt meh about others, and really despised a few, I really love this one. In fact, I put it in probably one of my favorite Beauty and the Beast retellings. It's a high fantasy romance, and it completely lives up to that. The romance is front and center, but there is very much this rich world building. It is set in a fictional world that has, in this particular area, though it does share some of the world with her Blade and Rose series, which I haven't read yet. It's on my to-be-read list, but I've been a little bit struggling to get through that. However, I'm even more excited to read that. It shares this world, and there's more of an Italian influence in this particular segment of the world as opposed to a French, which as I've seen in some of the discussions, and I think that's really fascinating, having different cultures sort of represented but still woven into this fantasy style. You don't have to have read the other stories, because I haven't read the other stories. No problems keeping up with it. And it was a lot of fun to get to dig into this, because the other thing that this is it is one of those retellings that hits the beats, but isn't exactly what the original one was. It just hits those themes. So as a general sum up, I will tell you it hits another one of my favorite tropes, which is the arranged marriage trope. You see, in this, Alès has an arranged marriage to Veron, who is the prince of one of the races of the Immortali, and he is a dark elf. And he is coming here for this alliance because they are actually in really, really dire straits. They're starving. You see, unfortunately, they were all asleep for 2,000 years, one of those magical sleeps that usually works out well in a lot of fantasy stories. But then, what happened to the agricultural system, their food networks, all of those things? They are in very bad, bad straits, and they need help. And of course, there's war on the horizon with some of the other nations and factions, and it's really quite a complicated time. And yet, now, there is a chance for peace and an alliance. So, I tell you, there are a lot of things that I want to talk about with this, but I also don't want to give spoilers. So I'm going to limit it, and I'm only going to reveal limited spoilers as it relates to key points for you as you're deciding whether or not you want to read it. So, moving into the aspects of the Beauty and the Beast retelling, this is sort of a Beauty and the Beast retelling, which is a double retelling, in which case both of them are the Beauty and the Beast. In their own cultures, they are considered quite attractive, and there is this gradual process of the two of them becoming more attracted to the other, though it's more of just, these are different people. What actually keeps them apart is a little bit more substantive than, oh, he doesn't look the way that I think a handsome man should look. In fact, it doesn't take her too long to start noticing his more attractive attributes. And the same for him, which makes sense, they still take time. But there is this issue of the differences within their cultures, the differences in expectations. And yet, Miranda, at the very beginning, gives us a reason that we should care for both. Now, I would argue that one of the most essential components of a Beauty and the Beast retelling is not necessarily the Beast or the Beauty, even though they are quite important. It's actually the sacrifice. And it is part of what sets it apart, that the Beauty must sacrifice her freedom, or in some way herself, and that is part of what creates this connection. And so this is a little bit of a spoiler, but it also expands on one of the things I appreciate with this, which is the breadth of the world and how real it feels. And Alès ends up sacrificing herself not to save her father, not to actually even secure peace, though that is part of it, but actually for her sister's happiness. Now, the characters in this all have the interesting facet, in my opinion, of being somewhat gray. They're good, they're bad, they have strengths, they have weaknesses, they're all flawed, and I love that. Because perfect characters for me get a little bit boring and very quickly. In this situation, Alessa's father is, he's a little bit of a cunning plotter. He's not an evil man, and it's interesting how the story kind of, we brush up against him from time to time, and more is woven through, and he's not a caricature, even though at times like, sir, do you have a Snidely Whiplash mustache? And no, he doesn't, and I appreciated that. But from Alessa's perspective, he can be pretty horrible. And he ends up tricking her, but she makes this sacrifice for real. She does offer herself to marry the Dark Elf Prince so that her sister can marry the man whom she loves. And I so love that, especially for the fact that it opens with Alessa and Bianca, two sisters, both beautiful, both very much admired. Bianca is actually their father's favorite, and yet there isn't resentment. There's actually also a third sister in this who has passed on, and there's a brother, and it's fascinating how these family dynamics, actually on both sides, are juggled in such a way that it feels real, and it's not as much the stock expectation of, you are my sibling, you are the favored one, I despise you. There's more to it than that, and Bianca and Alessa in particular are very supportive of one another. They feel like sisters who get along. They get along beautifully, and they support one another. And so it's the love for her sister that leads her to this particular decision. Now, Alessa herself has a number of flaws, which I found fascinating, because as I mentioned, she's also a beast character in her own right. Even though she makes that selfless move in that point, and at a few other points, she struggles with selfishness herself. It's not that surprising given the fact that she's lived sort of a bubbled life within certain royal circles and only seen certain things, and she works toward that. Now, the primary conflict between her and Veron isn't simply that they are from different cultures, but they have different expectations. In fact, there are consequences to everything within this story, which again is something I very much appreciate. This didn't start with Harry Potter, but I always referred to it as Potter protagonist power, because he would get into trouble, and if it was one of the good guys, who kind of like, well, we'll let you have an exception here, and there won't be any really serious consequences. Only the very bad people gave consequences, it seemed. I mean, there are exceptions, but that was just how it struck me. In this case, very much there are consequences even with good characters whom we come to feel fondly for. They disagree with certain things. Veron and Alessa don't always see eye to eye. In fact, she hurts him pretty badly a couple of points. He has some baggage of his own and some understandable issues, and even though things don't go perfectly, she is in a position where she winds up betraying his trust and having to rebuild that, which is a really great thing. And then of course it comes full circle, because when someone betrays someone's trust, because well, Veron is he's very calm, and he's very diligent, and he's very much by the rules, and he follows his mother's orders, which it's a matriarchal society, and so she is his queen, and he obeys what she says. Alessa is a lot more flexible in terms of her overall handling of situations, and if you tell her you have no power, there is nothing you can do, so on and so forth. She's very much one of those characters like, yes, I will turn this into a multiple choice and add my own answer. So it makes sense that they have some conflicts there, and they have to rebuild from that. And, she's not a complete screw-up. She actually makes a lot of successes as well. Those successes, because they're intermingled with failures, do make it a lot more compelling. And at the end of the story in particular, I was very happy for how it came all about. There's a lot of conflict. It's a fast read, great pacing. You're not going to feel like you're being lashed around into different genres. It all fits very well. And trying to keep this brief, but it is a longer story, and so it's tricky to summarize it quite as fast as some of the shorter ones I've been reading. But I love how there are elements from the Beauty and the Beast story that are woven in here. The library is a key part of this, but it's presented in a very different way, and this actually, this reminds me very much of a Beauty and the Beast retelling in sort of the same vein as the Cinderella retelling in Ever After, but with more fantasy characters. And the library element, I absolutely adore it. I love how it's woven all the way through and how it gives us this great insight into Alessa's heart, as well as into her family and to her history. And that was wonderful. The roses make an appearance, and they too are very nicely played. There are also unicorns in this. There are dragon shifters with their own unique lore, and yes, I'm not going to go into all the details and spoil that for you, but it's just lovely. The cultures are also quite distinctive, as well as those of the dark elves. Now, oftentimes what I've run into in fantasy romance stories where the romance is front and center is that world building and extended character development is not as important. Mostly because the reader is there to see what's going on, and so it's more of a trapping. There are curtains set up to give it a little bit of a unique appearance, but it doesn't have as much importance within the story itself. And I was really delighted to see in this that Miranda actually went back to Norse mythology to get some of her information on the Dark Elves, and that's woven in. They're subterranean, they're matriarchal, but not in a way that feels like it's women leaders are evil. Again, not to give spoilers, but to give a little bit of information about the Dark Elf Queen, who is Veron's mother. She is a very stern and resolute woman, but she is not cruel. There are points where there are cultural, I'm not quite sure how we're going to deal with this. I disagree with you, and I'm the queen, therefore I have the final word. And she holds her confidences close. There are a lot of hints in this of more that's going on, but she herself is not an evil character. She's just very stern, and you're not going to cross her. I suppose another way that you could look at her as being a very Spartan woman, but not unloving toward her family, as sometimes that caricature tends to go. So that was great to see. I love seeing those infusions of literature in there, and the mythology it's woven in a very nice way. It doesn't stand out, it doesn't stick out, it just feels like a natural part of the world building. But I love the Eddas, and reading those was a very big part of my childhood, and so whenever I see that, I get so excited. And, you know, I like the way that she builds on these characters, and the title, No Man Can Tame. I don't think this is a spoiler, but I really liked that. At points, there were sort of allusions to the taming of the shrew, except not exactly. Subversions of it might be a better way, but in a respectful way that still satisfies the tropes. And so I was catching that, and I was thinking, it's almost, it's like, you know, someone took kind of that idea and decided, flip this over here, because Alessa all the way through, even with her weaknesses, has an indomitable personality. Now she does do some things that raise some eyebrows, and she has to make amends, and it's really interesting seeing how that goes. Not everyone automatically likes her, and she has a lot of growth she has to go through, and Veron has to kind of ease up a little bit, get a little bit more flexible himself, while also realizing that it is okay for him to love as well, because, you know, this particular fellow, he has been hurt, and not necessarily in the most traditional way that you might expect in this. So all in all, I definitely recommend this story. There are sex scenes if that's something that you like, are cautious about. They're not erotica, they're not porn, they're not fade to black. The act is shown, but in a way that is not gratuitous, and important things do happen within it, so I don't recommend skipping them. And all in all, let's see, violence-wise, it's what you would expect from a high fantasy story. There is some violence. There's a great portion of the romance. It is a slow burn with the growing into friendship and then into the romance, and it hit all the high notes for me. And yeah, I love a good arranged marriage story. I tell you, it's an instant conflict situation, you know, because not only do you now have an escape for, oh, they need to be having some romantic contact with each other, oh good, we can skip over the awkward points and just move to more awkward points, and that's fantastic. And when you add in intercultural issues, especially interspecies issues such as dark elves and humans or whatever it might be, well then now we're talking about some serious conflict here and some potential misunderstanding. And you know, I feel like I sound like a terrible person to say conflict. I want conflict in these stories. I would like misunderstandings, yes, thank you, and things that are weird and strange. It's a really great story, so I hope that if this is your thing, that you pick it up, give it a read. And as we're chatting about this, why don't you tell me one of your favorite Beauty and the Beast retellings, and if it's your favorite, why you like those stories so much. So I will be talking to you later. I hope you have an absolutely wonderful day. The sequel for this particular story, which is, let's see, I wrote it down here so I wouldn't forget, Bright of the Moon. It will be coming out. It is actually going to be focusing on characters who we have met, not Alas and Veron, which I was going to end this, but I will add this one thing. It is a standalone story, and it was very satisfying in its conclusion, which is so hard to do in a high fantasy story, in my opinion, at least from the writing standpoint. I always want to linger. And the secondary characters did feel like they could take on their own stories, and I'm excited to see how these characters who we have briefly seen are going to have their own. But Alessa's and Veron's story, while I wouldn't say no to seeing more of them in other stories, it does feel like it's nicely completed here. So, I'm not going to ramble anymore. I hope you have an absolutely wonderful day, and I will talk to you later. Bye.